Hello, friends, and welcome to our fifth installment of Co-Parenting Simplified the Fayr Way. I'm Michael Daniels. I'm the founder and CEO of the co-parenting app Fayr, which stands for Family Advocacy is Your Responsibility. Fayr is the best, most intuitive, and crisp, modern co-parenting app for co-parents to stay well documented in preparation for, during, and post-legal proceedings. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Gabrielle Hartley, who is the author of the bestseller Better Apart. Everybody, if you haven't heard about the co-parenting book, it's fantastic. And just the Better Apart method is something I just strongly recommend to everyone. And Susan Guthrie, who is the host and founder of the Divorce and Beyond podcast, which also highly recommend. These two women have combined over 30, many years, many years experience. And provide a lot of experience and background. We are very excited today also to be joined with our special guest, Rhonda Nordyke. Rhonda, we just went over that right before coming on too. But Rhonda is the founder of the Women's Financial Wellness Center. She's an accomplished speaker and international author. Rhonda brings over 15 years of strategic planning, business development, and leadership to help empower women. So Rhonda, thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Rhonda, this is really exciting. In fact, I was telling everybody earlier, I sported my money tie today because it's going to be fun. Money is a massive thing, and what you speak to, financial anxiety that a lot of particularly women experience, especially during these times. And maybe you're thinking about separating, and you've been a homemaker, and now you have to be a breadwinner, and a lot of this stuff. Navigating this is very difficult. So we're excited to hear about your 15 plus years experience and what you've learned and how you can help these women.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. It's interesting because we were talking offline before we hopped on here, and yeah, there certainly is a lot of anxiety, right, around this whole situation. But I think, women are really good at when they have the facts. And so I always approach situations to say, let's get the facts. It's kind of like if you are carrying around this false sense of overwhelm related to your credit score. There's been women I've met with and they say, my credit score is 400. I'm like, 400? They're like, oh, yeah. Well, have you looked? Well, no. Well, how do you know it's 400? And then we pull it up and it's over 600. I mean, is it ideal? Maybe not, but it's certainly not 400, right? And so I think women just have a tendency to carry a lot of that heaviness without actually getting the facts. And in some cases, they realize, hey, I do have enough that I maybe could figure out how I'm going to leave the situation or think outside the box.
Yeah, assume the worst and hope for the best. Check out that FICO score, huh? No, that's great. We just love to get your feedback because, as we talked about, this financial anxiety is a real thing, and a lot of people get they confuse it for I need to be on medication or something. But really, if you just empowered yourself and took advantage of some of the resources out there, I know you do a lot of coaching, and some of those just 1, 2, 3 easy steps to put yourself on a path that you alleviate a lot of that stress. And so we'd love to hear about what people are going through, exactly how they're feeling stuck, and maybe you can elaborate that. How do they get unstuck?
Yeah, so getting unstuck, there's a couple of things. One is, especially now, right, especially for the people that are still, well, they are stuck at home, physically and figuratively, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of helping them find the resources, find the financial information, find the documents. It's a great time for them to start watching the mail or organizing their stuff or getting ready, stuff ready for taxes. So it's actually, as much as it's a challenging time, it's a really great time for women to be gathering information without maybe even setting off some alarms, or men for that matter too, right? Like they can start gathering the information, organizing it in a fashion that makes the most sense for their situation and being prepared so that, depending on where they're at in the country, when the quarantine's lifted, that they're prepared to be able to move forward in whatever way that looks like for them.
I have a question around that, Rhonda, because, I've always found that fear is really one of the big emotions people feel as they enter into divorce. And fear is really immobilizing for most. It paralyzes them. And so I love what you're saying about educate yourself, start moving forward. What would your suggestions be on the financial side? What are the baby steps perhaps people could take to start pulling together the financial or getting the information? Where would you advise people to start?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. One is, I mean, obviously watch the mail, right? And so as things come in, you can be, taking pictures of those kinds of things. As the taxes are being prepared, it's a great way for us to grab a copy of those. But in addition to that, women are really good private investigators, and men can be really great private investigators when they need to be, right? And so it can be, looking for bank statements or credit card statements, obviously tax returns. I've had some of my clients recently who have purchased homes within, the last year and a half. I'm like, hey, go back and see if you can reach out to the lender and get a copy of the documents that were, put into place, because it's a great way for us to be able to start. So, bank accounts, credit cards, watch the mail for statements, start looking for stuff. Oh, I happen to be cleaning out the office and I found, life insurance policies. I think the other part of this is people feel like they have to decipher everything when they're in that preparation mode. And really the goal is gather documents. You don't have to make sense of everything. Just start gathering anything financial related. And certainly, part of what we do is help them organize that in a way that makes sense and educate along the way on what we've discovered.
I think
that's
a lot
great.
of people are really paralyzed even to start to do these baby steps. I know I'm involved in a nonprofit that does a lot of education around finance called Savvy Ladies in New York. What kind of things do you recommend to people who literally can't even deal with it to the extent where they can't even take a picture of the mail, like they're just too emotionally flooded to make any movement at all?
Yeah, it's a challenging spot to be in, certainly, right? So I feel like as people are going through divorce or contemplating divorce, they really need three key people, and I call it the core team. And it's a financial expert, a legal expert, and a therapist, right? So, I mean, there may be some times when it's like, listen, I actually need to enlist the help of a therapist or a counselor to help me work through some of the fear pieces to overcome that hump, to take a picture of the document or watch the mail or whatever. So
even a strategic divorce coach, I actually train people to become divorce coaches, and sometimes that kind of training can help somebody to deal with the problem at hand versus a therapist who's maybe doing more behavioral psychology. But I think that that's exactly on point. Can be really, really hard for people, and there's sometimes critical times are missed because they're just burying their head in the sand.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, having that support, right? I mean, having people that you can rely on as you're going through this, knowing that you're not alone. I mean, there was a situation really probably about 6 years ago that really stands out. And it was a woman who, Gabrielle, to your point, was so overwhelmed by just even gathering the documents. And we gave her a very clear checklist, but there was also a part of it that we needed to be able to, first of all, empower her to know what to look for and where to look for it. But then also, there were times when she's like, okay, I know I need to be doing this. And she calls somebody for a boost, right? Like, hey, we know you can do it. Just that education and the encouragement, right? That can help along the way. Because I think it's really easy, or unfortunately kind of forced to be easy, to be isolated and forget oh yeah, I can ask for help.
Right.
I can ask people to encourage me to gather the information, or start taking some of those baby steps. So finding that
I love that.
support group is important.
That whole idea of asking for help, you'd think it'd be easier for people, but I've recently been involved with several different programs and writings all about empowering, especially women, not that men don't need it too, to ask for help, especially now when you may be making less money than usual, maybe to ask your landlord for a price reduction. People want to help, people can help, and, better to ask for to pay half than to move out, then you have nowhere to be, and then your landlord has nothing to pay towards their expenses. So I mean, there's that's just one example of many of how asking for help can help you navigate a tough situation, because today, in addition to the normal financial stress that people going through divorce are going through, oftentimes it's a double whammy, because they're employed or their soon-to-be ex is unemployed.
Yeah, absolutely. And Susan and I were talking before, and I had said, one of the strategies that we use, and it's meant for negotiations, but honestly, I mean, I think sometimes when we think negotiation, we think it has to be like these big, huge negotiations, and sometimes it's some of the smaller stuff that's just as impactful and as powerful. And there's an acronym that I have shared called ANOT. It's ANOT. And I can just share really briefly how to tee this up, but it's been really helpful, because I think even in asking, like, oh my gosh, I need to ask for a reduction in rent, or I need to ask for this, it's like, I don't even know where to start, right? So it becomes awkward and then we avoid it. So the A stands for acknowledge, right? Like, just start with an attitude of gratitude in some form or fashion. Hey, thank you so much for how responsive you've been. I really appreciate it. Or I really appreciate how great this place is. I feel safe here. Just start with something that seems genuine to your situation. And then the N is naturally. So we just acknowledge the fact that as much as we want to say otherwise, we as humans think of ourselves first, right? Even if it's a subconscious thing. And so we just kind of point out the obvious. Naturally, I fill in the blank. And I'll come back and give an example. And then the O is obviously. And then we just acknowledge, what are they looking for out of this situation? Naturally, I, obviously you. And it's not obviously with an attitude. It's like just pointing out, like, hey, obviously, right? So tone on that is important. And then the T is the ask. So what are you asking for? So Gab, if we use your example of, hey, listen, we want to negotiate the rent piece, right? So we would say, hey, thank you so much for just taking great care of this place. I feel amazing. I feel really safe here, whatever. Naturally, I want to continue to stay here because it seems to be a great fit for my family. My kids are in the school district. Obviously, you need to get paid, right? See how that works? Naturally, I, obviously you. And then the ask is, hey, would you be willing to work with us? We're going through a really challenging time, or I'm going through divorce, or I've lost my job. Can we work out an arrangement?
I love this.
Like, seriously,
fabulous.
That's a 3-minute clip that we're carving out and we're going to put it out on its own.
Yeah.
Love that.
Great.
Thank you.
Trademark that tiny little thing.
I do want to know, though, the T. What does T stand for?
The ask.
The ask.
The ask.
Okay. Where did the T come from? That's really a Noah.
What's so interesting to me as you bring that up, it's all about interpersonal relationships, because even though these are business matters, there's still that personal element where you're showing consensus. Like, we agree on these sort of things, and you're going about it where I have courage to ask for what I need, but still consideration to also acknowledge what it is that they're looking for. And I think you're going to get a lot further when you're able to put those two together.
All human, right?
It transcends all areas of life, and so this is very helpful information, because sometimes I think we go into the financial world thinking that it's so cold. These are still people, and there's still ways to be effective.
You're a person, Rhonda.
Well, you know what I mean. If you're approaching a landlord, you're approaching.
No, it's totally teasing.
Well, and let's be honest, right? Like, even in working with, it's setting expectations, right? Whether we're working with the attorneys, we're working with financial folks, we're working with whoever we're going to need throughout the process, right? Like, it is just so important. And I think that for people that are contemplating or going through divorce, as painful and as challenging as that process is, it is definitely a great opportunity for us to look at, how are we communicating? How are we being resilient? Are there things that we can do so that we come out of this situation in a better spot, right?
That's what my whole book is about, that part.
Right.
Your divorce is your chance to reframe your life and to
totally
get you a book. We'll talk about that after.
Totally. Yes, I would love that. It's just really, it's a really valuable pruning time, I guess, even though it's painful, to see people come out of it, with the opportunity and the skills to thrive, right?
Yeah, well, and that's a life skill right there. You called it a negotiation, and I can see it's a perfect way to walk into any negotiation, but it strikes me, I'm actually rereading one of my favorite books, Difficult
Oh,
Conversations, like the best book about having difficult conversations, because I've been having a lot of people ask questions about, how do I tell my spouse I want to get divorced? How do I tell my kids? This, what you just described in a knot, is really how to approach any difficult conversation with,
Absolutely.
or any conversation, in a way that is not immediately alienating, or it's designed to create connection, create a common cause, and find a way to work through things
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
So it's a great 4 steps for people. You've already gotten something out of this.
totally. And I have a friend named Anat. I can't wait to tell her.
Yeah.
I was ANAT. But anyway, like as soon as we're done, I'm totally
Yeah.
tell her. You're an acronym and it's a good one. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things, Rhonda, that we spoke about, and Michael mentioned the word earlier, and so I definitely wanted to hit on it, is that word stuck. Because and Gab, maybe you're getting these emails as well. I am getting emails and outreach through the podcast, et cetera. And the word stuck is in almost every single one of them. And people are feeling financially stuck, emotionally stuck, financially stuck. And the financially stuck leads to the other emotionally and,
And physically stuck.
physically stuck. Yeah.
They're stuck in their house with their spouse.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way that, no. Well, and that's causing such issues. I mean, I really hadn't, we're all in situations, hopefully, where we're stuck in the house with someone we want to be stuck with. The idea, we can maybe conceptualize in a way what it must be like to be stuck in a house with someone we don't want to be stuck with. But I'm actually, receiving the feedback, working with clients who are in homes in the midst of divorces with spouses who know how to push their buttons and upset them. And it goes way beyond feeling stuck. I mean, this is true. They have no respite. They have no way to get away. And that includes financially. They have no way to unentangle themselves. So beyond the baby steps that people can do to pull together information, are there baby steps that people can do to start separating out finances or helping with the finances to help start getting unstuck?
I think a lot of times it, again, starts with the awareness piece, right? Like we have to get a lay of the land of what's there. And I think the tendency with people being stuck right now is they're kind of in a pressure cooker. And so everything is amplified and a little more tense than it normally would be. But I think it's just an opportunity for people to be thinking outside the box. And so they can gather the information. Again, I always like to say, let's get the facts, because what happens is they'll say, well, I'll give you X amount for this, or you can keep that. And they just start throwing random stuff out. And it's like, okay, maybe that's not helping, right? Like, let's just put some of those conversations on pause, start figuring out what seems to make the most sense as far as that next step, and start gathering the data, gather the information. I mean, I know it sounds a little bit like a broken record, but it is such an important part, of this process. And what I find is that once women have the information or men have the information, they make really good decisions. The problem is you have one person who's handled the finances, one person who hasn't, and they don't necessarily know what's going on. There's people that are getting locked out of bank accounts because they're not sharing the passwords. I mean, it can be a real cluster. And so it's having a checklist of things of what they're looking for. And I go back to, people can be really good scavengers, really good private investigators when they have to be. And having the people that can help them think outside the box on where to look for some of those things is really, really important, as they're contemplating or going through the process. So, certainly podcasts are great, a great way for them to be able to listen. I do have a podcast called Divorce Conversations for Women. And the feedback that we're hearing is, oh my gosh, Rhonda, like it is really providing a sense of hope and comfort to know that I'm not alone. There's a lot of, again, practical things that they can be doing. But gathering is really important, and if they have joint accounts or joint credit cards or whatever, like they can gather that information even if they haven't had it before, you know. So it's really important. And I think, the other thing is too, I was talking with a lady the other day and she said, prior to COVID, I was about 40%, well, a couple weeks before COVID, I was about 40% knowing that I wanted to move forward with the divorce process. And I have an online course called Divorce Planning for Women, and she went through the course. And after the course, she said I was at an 80%. Like, okay, we've moved the needle. I have clarity. I feel like I know what the next steps are, yada, yada. But then COVID hit, and she goes, yeah, then she kind of like went back to I don't know if she went back to 40, but I mean, she backslid a little bit, right, in her decision. And now as the quarantine's being lifted in certain states, it's providing the opportunity for people to lift their head up and say, yeah, now what? Like, where am I going to go, next? And so I've had a conversation with her since, and she goes, okay, I'm moving out to move with a friend. So that I can get some clarity. And I've actually talked to several people who that's the case, right? They might not be able to rent an apartment. They're still trying to figure out the finances on what they could afford. And certainly we can help them with some of those questions. But just going somewhere, going to family, going to a second home, going to a cabin, just getting away to create some space and then developing a game plan, from there. I think the other thing is, doing some of the attorney interviews and gathering the team before you actually file can also help. I think there's a sense of people feeling like they have to do it themselves. And there's a lot of information out there. Like, hey, I'm just going to Google all this information. And I feel like more information sometimes doesn't create more clarity. It creates chaos. And so they're like, well, I heard this and that. And now I really don't know where to start. I didn't before, but now I certainly don't.
So there's two things that you said that I really want to just comment on. Number one is I want anyone listening to just really take heed to Rhonda's advice that I'll put as taking a step back is the best way to move forward. Right? Yep. Because when we take a step back, we're going to be responsive rather than reactive, and we're going to have the space to get clear and get away from the swirl. And then to the second point that Rhonda just made was, I'm just going to say that as less is more. There's too much information out there now. I mean, it's amazing that everybody is posting things and sharing things because people are finding themselves with more time, and there's more YouTube channels and podcasts now than ever in the divorce space. But be very careful of who you are listening to. It is not one size fits all. Rhonda, I'm sure your podcast is amazing. I know Susan's podcast is wonderful, and I'm sure there are many others. But just if you are trying to teach yourself, make sure that you are listening to people who have been vetted by people you trust.
That's a good point, because I think the other part too is the friends, so you've got all the friends who've been there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they don't know your situation.
That's right. And you don't know their situation either. People often will come in and they'll say, well, they'll start to analogize their life to somebody else's life. And after you listen to them for maybe, the first 20 or 40 minutes, you say, well, your soon to be husband or wife, maybe, not as money grabby as theirs was, sometimes people have a tendency to either minimize or catastrophize. And as professionals, our job is to bring them to the middle where they're at a spot of equanimity and they can make better choices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and especially, the thing with the friends and the family that has always struck me is you said you don't know their situation and they don't know yours. They often don't know their situation. When I hear people describe what happened in their divorce, so often their perception of how things worked out. Remember, that's always going to be colored by their thinking at the time. And when people are going through a stressful time, most of the time people aren't even remembering their own divorce clearly. So getting your advice from a family member or a friend. The other thing, and you kind of mentioned this, Rhonda, and it goes with that step back, is everybody, when they're facing a divorce, seems to want to jump ahead on the financial side to the divvying up and who's paying what part.
Totally.
And they do that way before they figure out what they have to divvy up. I always call it quantifying the marital pie. They want to chop that darn pie up and pass it out. You keep the house and I'm going to keep this and I'm going to keep that. But they have no idea what any of it's worth or what it costs. And I mean, then what happens is they make agreements about those things and then it turns out to not work financially and they have to backtrack and everyone gets upset. So
That's
a lot
right.
of what you're saying about pulling the information together ahead of time as the first steps and taking a breath to make sure you have everything is really a key to the whole process going well.
Yeah.
Don't jump ahead.
It's true. And I think, the organizational piece is super important. It sounds super simple, but it is really important from the beginning to organize and capture as much information as you can, right? Because, statistics show us that early on is where most of the shenanigans happens if people are going to try to move stuff around. And so, yeah, gathering as much information in the beginning and organizing it is really important.
And I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to comment that somebody is commenting on the not, and I just wanted I wanted to bring attention back to that because it was so amazing. And Barb, the way that you
Hi,
summarized
Barb.
I think is correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
So sorry, Ron. Continue with what you were saying. If I didn't knock you off your train of thought.
So I think the other piece throughout this whole process is just being and looking at it as an opportunity to build on our strengths. There's going to be some people that love the knowledge, they love learning, and this is a great opportunity for them to say, isn't that interesting, and start learning certain aspects about the process. I think one thing that I see as far as like, hey, I don't even know where to start, is the question I have. Hey, I'm contemplating divorce, I don't even know where to start. To which I say, well, let's just hop on a call. We offer a 30-minute consult, and I say, okay, give me an idea of what you're looking for and what your biggest challenges are. And from that point, right, we can help them navigate through to say, hey, we want to start interviewing attorneys next. What are you looking for in an attorney? What process do you think, right? Because there's really 4 different ways. I had a conversation this afternoon with a lovely gal who I've known for a couple years, and she's considering divorce, and her husband's an alcoholic. And the long and short of it is she is new to Wisconsin. She moved here recently, and each state's going to have their own parameters and own way that they approach divorce. But I said, there's 4 different ways if we exclude pro se, but 3 different ways, right, that you can get divorced. Let's talk about some of those options. And I just wanted to be able to have her start thinking about which is going to be the best for her situation, right? Hey, here's the definition of what these look like, and start thinking about the situation. How do you think your husband's going to respond? Well, I don't really know, honestly. Okay, well, here's the pros of this one, here's the cons of this one. And so I just give them like some things to be thinking about. And when we got done with the call, she said, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much better I feel. It's like after 30 minutes of just being able to reach out, right? We underestimate how important or powerful it can be to talk to somebody, talk to a live person, and not just be Googling online.
Totally. And also sometimes like we think we know how to do something and we like 96% no, but there's like a little like, oh, I didn't think of that. Or sometimes we don't have the confidence maybe to do things. And so we spend so much time and energy in that loop in our mind rather than actually activating and doing what we need to do. Welcome back, Susan.
I'm back. Sorry. I have no idea where I went.
So I think that's right. I think having that human touch, having that sense of not being alone can be really, really helpful. And like, it sounds like having you as a cheerleader. Let me ask you a question, Rhonda. Do you only work with people in Wisconsin, or where are you?
So the headquarters is in Wisconsin, but I have clients all over the country. So so we are working in other states and continuing to build out our network of trusted and vetted attorneys and advisors in those areas. But yeah, we've got, 10 questions to ask when interviewing an attorney, right? So they can just kind of be prepared going into those meetings if we aren't either virtually or physically able to be in those meetings with them, should they want that level of support.
That's great.
Yeah, it's so important for people to build that team. That's always been something, when I was a litigator, as a mediator, having an integrative team that you build to support whatever you need. But I would say, at least in my estimation, a financial advisor is almost the indispensable. Everyone thinks it's the lawyer. It's actually the financial piece for most people, because especially, you know, and I'll generalize, but women who are in many cases less knowledgeable about the family finances, or the husband, if he's the one who's less informed, because it's very hard to move through this process and make decisions, come to agreements. I mean, people may or may not know, but more than 95% of divorces end with some sort of an agreement that's reached either through mediation, negotiation, something. It's only a small percentage of cases go in front of a judge. But when you're coming to those agreements, you have to be able to make decisions. And you can't do that if you don't feel supported and you don't feel like you understand. So having someone like Rhonda who can help you with everything. You described something to me earlier that I'd like you to mention about the budgeting, because I think that's a piece that so many people just skip right over and then try to make decisions about the settlement without taking into consideration their needs.
It's huge. It's huge. So thank you for asking me about that, because, you know, I think it's one of those things where, you know, the budgets aren't sexy, glamorous, and they're not usually a lot of fun. But it's so important. You know,
at the other end of the line, it's amazing when they're done.
That's right. That's right. But I think for people, knowing that they don't have to do it themselves is helpful as well. So we have a process we take them through to help, you know, get a budget and a cash flow statement together early on in the process. Because I'll also say to them, hey, write down all of your what if questions. Just get them out of your head, get them on paper. We will help you, or we will find the people that will answer all the questions. Probably not right now, because you'll be overloaded, but let's get them answered, right, in a strategic format. And a lot of the questions revolve around, can I keep my house? If I can't keep my house, where am I going to go, and how much can I afford? So the reason that the budget piece is so important is because we get a baseline of where they're at and what we anticipate that the child support or maintenance might be. And sometimes I'll have the attorneys run those calculations early on, and they're like, Rhonda, we're not there yet. I'm like, I know, but can you just run the calculations so that we can pull this back in? Because here the attorneys run the calculations. And so it helps us to be able to plunk those numbers in as just a baseline. So then what happens is if we come back and we say, hey, look, it looks like you can afford, you know, $1,200 to $1,700 a month in rent, or whatever the number is. Now they can be empowered to go out and start shopping for apartments, because otherwise what happens is they go and look at the $2,500 a month apartment. They're like, oh, I don't even think I can afford this. So they don't sign anything and they leave, and then they, whatever. And then they go and look at the $800 efficiency, one bedroom in a bad neighborhood, and they feel bad because they feel like that's where they're going to have to be. And that's not necessarily the case, right? And so there's like all this extra guilt, shame, uncertainty. It enhances feeling stuck because they don't have the information they need. So if they know $1,200 to $1,700, and I say, okay, go start shopping for apartments, and when you find one, sign the lease. Like, it's
right. Well, if you legally can sign the lease under the terms of your state restraining orders. Many states would not allow you to do that.
Yes.
Got to be a lawyer for a second. Yes. Sorry.
Yes. So, yes. And so they're obviously getting, and again, we're including the attorneys in those conversations, right? Because, you know, we want to make sure that we're doing, but theoretically, right, they can go and start, you know, moving what they need to move forward with. So it's been really empowering.
I just want to mention one thing for any listeners who are wondering, well, you know, it's great that you're going to give me all this information, but what about my husband, or what about my wife? Like, what am I going to do if they don't agree with the way you see things? And I know not everybody knows about the collaborative process, and not everybody buys into the collaborative process. But when you are working on a collaborative team and you hire someone like Rhonda to work as part of your family's divorce team, you can have such an incredible, quick, reasonable outcome in a way that you cannot imagine happening any other way. Even if you're not in a collaborative process, if you can jointly agree to hire a CDFA or somebody who really understands the way that the law works and the way that the finances are distributed, and even if they're not an attorney, if they can work closely with your attorneys to understand how the maintenance and distribution and alimony or child support would run, you can really in a transformative way navigate your family and save tens of thousands of dollars in litigation that's not necessary. So just know that you can jointly hire someone. I don't know specifically, Rhonda, if you do that. You know, if that's something that like your firm, because you're smiling, so I'm like, you're probably like, I don't do that at all. But it's
as Susan and I were saying, my passion's helping women, right? Not saying the guys don't need help, and we don't hate men, but we do focus on helping the women.
Yeah.
And at some point, you know, we'll probably have a men's division, and I'll have a guy who's super passionate about helping the men that will head that up, right?
Maybe a woman who wants to help the men. But
Yeah,
the other thing I want to make sure we know, to what Gabrielle said, in mediation, I mediate divorces, and I love having a financial neutral involved to help the couple figure out the best way to work through dividing the finances and everything. I'm working on one right now, and it's a very complicated financial picture. They have a lot of moving pieces. They're extremely cooperative. They want what's best for their family. But because there's so many moving pieces, we brought in a CDFA to help, and it's been brilliant now. And that's in the mediation process, which so many families right now are facing or looking to for help because the courts are closed. I just want to make sure people understand CDFAs, financial help, you know, neutrals can help in all different.
They can actually help also in litigation, but in mediation and in collaborative, you don't need to have two different CDFAs. So
you can have a neutral.
I mean, you could have a neutral also in litigation, although it doesn't typically roll out that way.
It's not how litigation mindsets generally work. Yeah.
I'd like you to comment a bit on the aspects of divorce when we talk about when you're assessing, you know, your assets and liabilities. A lot of times people will end up making concessions because they don't. I guess that what I want you to do is give some direction to those people out there who don't have experience in this. They end up getting manipulated into agreeing to certain things that are really not in their best interest long term. Could you speak to an example of that? Because I know this is something that happens quite a bit with women who are less experienced with what those assets and liabilities are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a couple examples, and the one that I'm thinking of initially, I think is just kind of goes back to being able to ask the right questions and share your concerns. It's easy in this process to feel like, oh my gosh, extra pressure, right? Like I have to decide. And so I will often tell people, listen, so that can be, I'm happy to make a swift decision when I have all of the information. So it buys them some time if they feel like they're being pressured in any way to make a decision quickly. One of the clients I was working with, they did an appraisal. So there's the fair market value with the homes, and then there's the appraisal piece. And depending on how much they push back, sometimes people will use the fair market value and it's sufficient. And then there's other times where they may say, no, we actually want the home appraised. So there's two different options. But in this case, they were open to doing the fair market value. So we had a real estate agent that came in and looked at the home and gave them a number. And then they said, okay, well, actually, we want it appraised. So fine. So they had an appraisal, and the two numbers didn't match. And so the fair market value was $100,000 higher than the appraisal amount. And so it was 2 days before they were supposed to go to court for the final hearing. And the attorney said, well, you can actually have a little bit more time if you feel like you need to. Because she's like, this is a big, like, that was a lot of the equity that she was going to be getting was from the home. Right. So she calls me in the 11th hour on a Friday afternoon at 4:00, which is always when those calls happen. Right. And I said, hey, listen, it is okay. You can buy yourself the time, but let's talk through this. And so she at that point had an option. She could either hire another appraiser to go, and then maybe they would take the average of those two, depending on how they wanted to work that. Or we go back to the real estate agent and say, hey, can you reevaluate the fair market value? Well, what ended up happening was the real estate agent was able to find that the appraiser actually forgot to include the lakefront portion of that property, which was the impact of the $100,000 difference. And so I think that in that situation, Michael, like had we not chatted and she felt like, oh my gosh, it's 2 days away, like I can't push
agreed to
this back,
something.
she would have agreed to it, and she would have walked away from, you know, again, this wasn't necessarily a huge net worth situation, but when you're talking about $50,000 and that's the cash you're going to get, it's a big deal.
Yeah. It is.
You know?
Absolutely.
So, I think it's just, again, having a team of people. And I love the fact that, everybody on this call sees the value in working as a team,
Oh my God.
because
We are so team oriented. We're like,
I'd be lost without these two. Are you kidding me?
We're like,
I'd be lost.
This is Team Fayr, but
Couldn't tie my shoes. I know what you're saying.
No,
It's
but
such
it is
a big
true. A
deal.
lot of divorce professionals are so stuck in their lane, and unfortunately, I think it does a disservice both to the families going through divorce and to the global divorce narrative. So I'm always posting like hashtag the positive divorce movement. It's not like divorce is positive, but only by really recognizing who we're working with and what we're working for can we start to make people feel better, which is something that I think is really important about my job as a divorce mediator and lawyer and coach. I mean, I just feel like that's like what all of our jobs are. We might do it different ways, but like, right? Like Rhonda is helping people sort their finances, and Susan and I are helping people navigate the divorce process, and Michael is helping people communicate better through the divorce process. But it's all positive. So that's why, it's the positive.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think too, there's an aspect, of setting, like having expectations, right? When you're looking for professionals. And that is, I never want anybody that's reaching out to Women's Financial Wellness Center to feel like they're bothering us, or that they're being disrespected, or there's not this kindness piece. Like, I want anybody that's affiliated with what we're doing, like, I can't believe how nice these people are, right? Like, there is something to the kindness factor for people that are really feeling overwhelmed and in a really tough spot. And so if you get a bad vibe when you're interviewing somebody, listen to your gut, because there's probably something to that.
Totally. About your gut.
I thought of something that happened in one of my more recent mediations, and I wanted to ask you about it as a financial professional, because I'm sure that this conversation comes up for you. So as the neutral mediator, I was in a mediation with a couple who had a number of issues to deal with. We have 2-hour sessions, and they spent the 2-hour session, the entire 2-hour session, talking about the piano and what they were going to do with the piano, and the piano, and what the piano was worth. And, so it was one of those conversations as a neutral, how do you have that conversation with people about, the financial worth of the piano and the cost of talking about the piano. But then there's also that emotional component. And you must run into, I'm using that as an example, but you must run into, when you're talking about dollars and cents with people, you must run into the dollars and cents that are attached to the emotional content of things. And how do you take that into consideration when you're working with your clients?
Yeah, there's it's always amazing, right? Like and sometimes we think we can predict what the emotional hot buttons are going to be. Nope. So, I kind of go back to, and what I have seen, certainly, for example, the house, right? I mean, that's an obvious big one where, oh my gosh, we've raised our kids there. I don't want to uproot them. And there's certainly value to that, right? But I also think that once people are presented with the options, it hopefully helps them to see that there's a better way, right? Like, so with the piano conversation, well, okay, if this person keeps the piano, then what do you want in exchange for that? It's the whole quid pro quo thing, right? Like, there has to be something in this situation value that you could offset that, or chop it in the middle. No, we don't chop it in the middle, but
I suggested that. So
I mean, right?
By the way, sometimes the person who wins then saws it in the middle. Like, this happens, right? I mean,
yeah, you can't make this stuff up.
It's not about the thing.
No, it's not about the thing. And
it wasn't about the piano. It was about their daughter.
I had the same thing about a humidor.
Yeah. I had it over a stuffed singing frog. It was a frog that had a squeeze thing that it then sang a song, and I had a half-day hearing over the frog. I win. But I was the only one.
Well, so one of the attorneys that I work with here in Wisconsin has been doing this for a long time, and he was telling me about a situation like that. And in his case, it was artwork. So what he did was he said, okay, well, we're going to do it like a fantasy draft. And they ended up like running it almost like an auction, right? And eventually they were like, okay, like he kind of made a game out of it. And at the end of the day, they were like, okay, fine. Well, I guess I really don't want it. Yeah, you can have it. Well, I guess I don't really want it. And so it actually, like, his strategy actually worked out. But who wants to go to trial on over one item?
Well, there's the famous Beanie Baby case where the judge, the couple was fighting over their collection of Beanie Babies. If Google it, there's a picture of this in the courtroom, and there's a pile of Beanie Babies in front of the judge's bench. And what the judge ordered in that case was pile all the Beanie Babies up here in the middle of the courtroom. I'm going to flip a coin. Whoever wins gets to take one. And then the other person gets to take one, and you're going to go back and forth taking one until they're done. And that was the judge's solution. And I can't tell you how many times once that decision came out, how many judges I had deal with record collections and glassware. I mean, you name anything where there was more than one or there was property they were arguing about. That's how judges started.
The judge I used to work, he used to say, I don't do tchotchkes.
I imagine he did. Yeah.
Well, and I think there's something kind of on a flip side of that is taking a look at some of those things where I think people will say, well, I don't think it's really worth anything. And I had a couple situations recently with tools, right? Their husbands were in some form of either they own their own business or whatever, and the tools were part of that, whether they were snow plowing or construction or whatever. And they're like, he says it's not worth anything. And it's like, okay, well, maybe it isn't. I'm thinking that it might be. And so I said, well, let's weigh out these options. You X amount of dollars to hire somebody that is an expert in that, value the truck and the loader and the tools, and see what it comes back at. And we've done that several times, and it's been significant.
Oh, yeah.
And the return on investment was significant. But again, I think if it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's not worth anything, or she said it's not worth anything. Well, get the facts, right? There's people that can appraise jewelry. They can appraise tools. Blue Book, Kelly Blue Book value, of course, for the vehicles, right? Like, we have tools and people in place that can help. And even antiques, we can have people put some value to these things if it really becomes an issue, and then we figure it out from there.
Well, and some assets are appreciating. That has to be weighted, right? Some appreciating assets. And tools, like in that case, those have the potential for making money. So clearly that should maybe weighted. Is that a factor when they make these determinations? The money that will be made with those tools?
Well, it kind of depends, because they might see it as double dipping, right? Where you're getting paid on that and taking some on the backside. So, usually they'll take one or the other. But it's still, it's significant enough that I think it's just good to ask the questions. And yeah, there may be some additional costs in hiring an expert, but it's really worth it to get the figures.
Pennywise.
If it's the peace of mind factor, then you have to, the client has to know they can spend the money and get the answer.
Well, the other thing is they may not realize they need it for peace of mind. And the thing is, later on, if they don't do the work now, it will be harder later, and they may wind up living with resentment that they could have spared themselves, and they may be costing themselves a lot of money. So it's better to spend the money and the time in the short term, and then make a better long-term decision that's going to work, the span of years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, and I ran into the situation in a case that's a very amicable divorce, and the husband has an interest in a family business, and the wife was like, oh, I don't want any of that. And I said, well, that's perfectly fine. Do you know what that is? And she's like, no, it's just that. And I'm like, do you have any idea what that is worth? What that is made up of? We just need to know what you're saying. I don't want that.
Right.
It turned out that was worth $3 million his share. And it wasn't like he was trying to hide anything about it. It's just the conversation they had was very simple of, that's my family's. Do you want it? She said no. And they thought that would be the end. And what I had to explain is, she can absolutely make that decision. Anyone can make a decision to waive off on something they potentially might have a claim to, but they have to know what they're waiving off on. It has to be what we call an informed decision. Waiving off on, sure, I don't want that, and then finding out it's worth $3 million isn't going to work. You don't get to come back to court and say, oh, I didn't know it was worth $3 million. I changed my mind. If I'd known that, I might have wanted some of it. So that's the other thing for people, is to understand there's nothing about knowing the value that means you have to change your mind about what you want to do about that particular thing. She still ended up saying, no, I don't want it.
That's so right, Susan. Like, you have to know, like everything Susan said, what she said. Like, you could like give away whatever you want, but you have to know you're giving it away, right? And like, it's just, I mediate. That's like 80% of what I do. And I make people just have, or I don't make them, but I advise them strongly to meet a lawyer once, take good notes, ask good questions, get the answers, and then come back, and then you can agree to whatever you want. But to come in and make an agreement, and then later on, oh, I'm going to just have someone read it over, then they've gone ahead and made all kinds of agreements that they're upset about after the fact. And that is a setup for disaster.
It is.
Well, talk about that for a second, because one of the things that probably is my biggest hot button is just the I have several of them, but the imbalance of power. Right? The imbalance of power in situations. And I feel like there's a lot of times where the person with, the best negotiation skills and more money, right, is at an advantage. And I think people don't always want to acknowledge that, but I think there is some, I don't know, from what you guys are seeing, leveling the playing field, and yes, getting the right experts involved is certainly important. But are there other things that people can be doing if they feel that there's that imbalance of power?
I mean, the problem is oftentimes people don't feel there's an imbalance of power. They've been in it for so long. And I've had cases where I'm practically begging one of the people to like get an attorney to look this over, or even I go so far as to ask the other side if I can give some advice to sort of even the playing fields later now, so as to avoid problems later. But there are ways to relieve the power imbalance, one of which is to make sure that you get out all the information from maybe the quieter client. Make sure that everyone has time to say what they need to say, even if maybe it takes, 40 minutes of your hour to just get the quieter, more passive person to engage. But you have to be pretty active. You can't just say, oh, well, that's what my client wanted. That's not how I mediate, although there are mediators who just let it happen that way, unfortunately.
The problem is, I think when you just let it happen that way, is the person who is feeling on the lower side of the power imbalance will get to a point where they need to make some decisions, but they don't feel able to do it. And so they'll keep coming back for mediation sessions. They'll keep vacillating between, I don't know, maybe I have to think about it. The other party starts to get increasingly frustrated.
Right.
And eventually one of them, usually the frustrated one who's more, will go off and get a litigator. Okay. And the whole thing goes off and goes where. So, my thing with that situation is trying to make sure that the party who's feeling, or even if they don't know, but I know, I've been doing it for a long time, I can tell when there's an imbalance, making sure they get that right support, making suggestions about perhaps it would be helpful to talk to a CDFA to work on budgeting. Would that be helpful to you? Or someone like Kate Anthony, have a coach who's going to help you deal with some of the emotional content that seems to be holding you back. And I always make sure make sure the other side, the frustrated one, understands that by getting support for the other person, it's going to help their entire process move forward. Because that stalemate of, I don't know what to do and why won't you do something,
right,
is a disaster.
Right. That's exactly right. And you can't move forward if both parties don't have their feet firmly rooted in the ground and are not both ready, willing, and able to participate. Oftentimes one person will say, can I talk to you? And I have to say, no, I need both people engaged, unless of course the other person says it's okay. And then we give them both even time. Because if you let the passive person stay passive, then it's a problem. Then they wind up with an agreement that they want to modify, and then they go to you, Rhonda, and they say, you shouldn't have gone to mediation. What were you thinking?
Well, it's a good point, though, that people can go to a CDFA at any point in the process. I mean, ideally at the beginning, but don't think that if you've started your process and now you're like sort of in that morass of, I don't understand, I don't know, we don't, blah. You can go to a CDFA and get financial help at any point in time.
Yeah.
And it will often be the plug that gets pulled that unsticks things.
Totally.
All the time for me.
A linchpin, right?
It is. It's huge. I always say, like, hey, I can come in the middle of the movie. I just got to figure out like the plot and the characters, and then we're, characters, right? And we're good to go. But yeah, I met with a lady right before COVID, and we were like the only ones in Starbucks before they shut their doors. And she was in the 11th hour. Like, she had a marital settlement agreement draft or something at least started, a property division worksheet. She didn't understand anything about what was going on. The attorneys kept saying, well, this is fair. This is fair. Well, yeah, but what does that mean? So, I spent some time with her, educated her on some of the options. She goes, Rhonda, you're the first person who's told me half of these things. This makes total sense to me. I'm totally on board. They had done mediation and had given a range. And I said, well, why are they doing the lower end of the range? We know what the range is. Let's go back and ask for the higher amount of the range, because we have the data to support your budget, and that we can, support that the maintenance is necessary for that amount. And sure enough, she got the higher amount of the maintenance, and that divorce actually was finalized during COVID, 4 weeks after she hired me to help her. And that thing had been going on for way too long, and it was like this, just like saying the same thing, hoping for different results, as we know, right? The definition of insanity. Like, you're not going to get different results by saying the same thing. But I did call the attorney ahead of time, and I'm like, listen, our client is on the verge of a breakdown. I met with her physically. She is like not in a good spot. So we need to do a better job of listening to what she's actually trying to say. Okay, I'm going to bring her on the line. And he did a great job. He was like, okay, I'm listening. Like, he just really like
he needed you to focus him on what was going on.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes, right? Like, oh my gosh. But we got it done, and she was super happy, and she's going to be writing a really good review here soon. So that's fantastic, because it was recent, right? Like,
yeah,
she's able to move on and run her businesses, which is half the battle. So that's awesome.
That's awesome.
I see Barb is asking what a CDFA. Oh, good. Somebody just put that in there. A CDFA is a certified divorce financial advisor. It's a special, Rhonda, you explain it, but it's a special certification.
Yeah. Certified divorce financial analyst. And so basically our job is to be able to not only help people navigate through the financial aspects, we can run numbers, but the biggest thing is we could, if we were asked to be expert witnesses in the courtroom. So it's just a really detailed exam. And, there's 4 different parts to it: tax, marital property law, etc. Case study. It was crazy. But yeah, I mean, that is kind of the gold standard for financial professionals and working with people that are going through divorce.
So incredible, valuable. Rhonda, I really want to thank you for coming on. And honestly, the work you're doing is incredible. I think I can't stress to people enough. We can establish nobody's in their right mind when they're going through this process. And to get somebody who is, very sane, so to speak, going through this, that it is, especially on an issue of finances and Women's Financial Wellness Center. I want everybody to go check it out. Their link is down here at the bottom. Ron, do you want to share any of your handles, your social handles?
Sure. Well, I can just share the website, womensfinancialwellnesscenter.com. We are certainly on Instagram at womensfinancialwellnesscenter.com, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. So yeah, come check us out, follow us, and certainly, yeah, we love what we're doing. I love helping women. I love helping people. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to have conversations with other people that are also passionate about empowering people going through divorce. So thanks for having me.
Well, we're very grateful to have you. What's that, Gab? You were to say something?
It's awesome to meet you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, ladies. Well, thank you very much. And we will be back here next week with someone else. We'll figure that out.
We're gonna figure it out.
We'll talk about it.
Time. Don't forget a knot.
A knot.
Bring it up
Yeah.
again, Rhonda.
A knot.
A-N.
Yeah.
Do it again.
ANOT. Acknowledge, naturally, obviously, and then the ask.
The ask.
Got it. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. See you next Thursday.